Ever wondered about the remarkable life behind that luminous smile you see in classic Hollywood films? In this video, we're reviving the memory of Gene Simmons, a post-war British teenager who stormed Hollywood's golden age, battled industry giants like Howard Hughes, and emerged as one of the era's most quietly enduring stars. From her first steps on the London stage singing "Daddy Wouldn't Buy Me a Bow Wow" to her final appearances in animated masterpieces, she wove a tale of resilience in an industry known for devouring young talent. Join us as we explore how Gene Simmons transcended conflicts with powerful moguls, overcame personal struggles, and transformed into a beloved actress whose understated elegance continues to captivate modern audiences. This is the story of a classic star who refused to be overshadowed and whose legacy still shines long after the bright lights of old Hollywood have faded. Imagine a young dancer in wartime London performing a whimsical tune called "Daddy Wouldn't Buy Me a Bow Wow" alongside her sister, her family scrimping for every penny, her father's memory lodged in her mind as a softly spoken figure she barely got to know. Who would have guessed that this reserved teenager, who only half believed in her own potential, would soon be catapulted into international stardom under the glitzy lights of post-war Hollywood? Yet that's precisely what happened to Gene Simmons. Over the course of several decades, she transformed herself from an unassuming London schoolgirl into one of the most admired and versatile actresses of her generation, racking up iconic roles on both sides of the Atlantic, and eventually winning a Golden Globe for a performance that showcased her elegant comedic timing. Despite periods of depression, battles with producers like the notoriously difficult Howard Hughes, and even a struggle with alcoholism later in life, she somehow kept re-emerging with memorable parts, right up to her final years on screen. This is the story of Gene Simmons, the British actress, not to be confused with the Kiss bassist Gene Simmons, whose wide-ranging career spanned from the twilight of World War II into the early 21st century, and who left behind a tapestry of films treasured by audiences around the globe. She was born Jean Marilyn Simmons on January 31st, 1929, in Lower Holloway, North London. At first glance, her early environment appeared unremarkable. Her father, Charles Simmons, was a former Olympic gymnast who had won a bronze medal at the 1912 Summer Games, but by the time Jean arrived, the family's modest means meant her father had to work as a physical education teacher. When World War II broke out, the Simmonses evacuated London for Somerset, seeking refuge from the Blitz. Charles found employment at Sidcott School, instructing children in fitness. All the while, Jean and her siblings entertained themselves with small-scale performances, singing popular English songs. One particularly vivid image from this period is of Jean belting out "Daddy Wouldn't Buy Me a Bow Wow" while her older sister harmonized, a makeshift stage, a little audience, and a spark that hinted at a deeper talent. By her early teens, she'd already decided she wanted to be an acrobatic dancer. Given her petite stature and innate grace, dance instructors pegged her as someone with promise. Then the war ended, and the family returned to London. Jean enrolled in the Ada Foster School of Dance in 1944. Here, she encountered the swirl of post-war British theater and film, which were desperate for fresh-faced talent. One day, by chance, she caught the attention of the English film director Val Guest, who was casting roles for his movie Give Us the Moon, 1944. Margaret Lockwood, then a beloved star, was headlining the film. It was an era when British cinema was re-energizing itself after wartime constraints, and new faces were in demand. Jean, all of 14 or 15, stepped into a minor role. No one would have guessed that within a couple of years, she would be one of Britain's fastest rising screen personalities. she found herself snagging bit parts in several 1940s films, gradually building a name. One of the more notable early experiences was in Caesar and Cleopatra, 1945, directed by Gabriel Pascal and starring Vivien Leigh and Claude Rains. The shoot took place partly in wartime conditions, which was challenging enough, but it also introduced Joan to a talented actor named Stuart Granger, her future husband. During these minor film years, studio heads sensed potential in her. At some point, she secured a 7-year contract that promised her a series of roles, effectively ensuring she wouldn't vanish after a handful of fleeting appearances. Her major breakthrough came in David Lean's Great Expectations, 1946. Lean was already well known for his meticulous approach, and the film's adaptation of Charles Dickens's novel was an ambitious project. Casting the 17-year-old Jean as Estella opposite John Mills's portrayal of Pip was a gamble, but it paid off magnificently. The film became a critical and commercial triumph, the third most popular British film at the box office in 1947, and it's still regarded as one of the best adaptations of Dickens ever put to celluloid. For Jean, the experience was transformative. She had, until then, thought of acting as a fun pastime, an easy way to earn £5 a day, meet famous people, and help her financially strapped family. Suddenly, Lean's insistence on quality and depth forced her to see acting as an art form worthy of lifelong devotion. She often noted afterward that Great Expectations was the turning point that convinced her to take her career seriously. Following that success, she took on further assignments, some hits, some misses. The momentum really ramped up with Hamlet, 1948, spearheaded by Sir Laurence Olivier. In a stroke of good fortune, Jean was cast as Ophelia, a role that showcased her ability to combine an ethereal presence with hidden emotional currents. Her performance led to her first Academy Award nomination, a remarkable feat for someone still in her late teens. By this point, she was recognized internationally, not just as a sweet-faced starlet, but as a genuinely skilled actress who could hold her own in Shakespeare. Sir Laurence Olivier was so impressed that he offered to arrange for her to study at the Bristol Old Vic, an institution revered for developing classical acting chops. She declined, perhaps due to a mix of youthful confidence and a sense that real-world experience on film sets was teaching her more than formal drama school could. Like so many British actresses of the time, she then felt an almost gravitational pull toward Hollywood. She had proven her worth in British cinema, but to achieve global renown, crossing the Atlantic was the next logical step. Around this time, her personal life shifted too. She starred with Stuart Granger in Adam and Evelyn, 1949, and the sparks were undeniable. They married in 1950 when Jean was just 20. British fans, meanwhile, adored her. In 1950, she ranked as the 4th most popular actress in Britain, no small accomplishment given the competition from legends like Anna Neagle and Margaret Lockwood. Eager to chase bigger opportunities, she and Granger moved to the United States and, by 1956, had both become American citizens. This new chapter wasn't without drama. Jean signed with RKO Pictures, which was at that time under the ownership of Howard Hughes, a magnate infamous for meddling in his stars' private lives. Legend has it that Hughes took an unwanted fancy to Jean. Her husband Stuart Granger famously warned him off, leading to a vendetta. Hughes weaponized his control over her roles, instructing director Otto Preminger to make Jean's time on set miserable. One story goes that her co-star was told to slap her repeatedly in certain scenes, in an attempt to break her resolve. After a while, the co-star snapped, punching Preminger out of frustration and refusing to keep tormenting Jean. The feud escalated. At one point, William Wyler wanted to cast her in Roman Holiday, 1953, a film that later catapulted Audrey Hepburn to superstardom. But Hughes refused to let Jean out of her contract to do it. She lost the career-making role, effectively because of a mogul's petty grudge. Eventually, she wrested free from Hughes through a court case, although the settlement forced her to do one last film for RKO without compensation. That film flopped, but at least it freed her from a professional environment that had become toxic. Her marriage to Granger survived these early Hollywood battles, but the couple's relationship soon faced other pressures. They relocated to England in 1955 to star in Footsteps in the Fog, a Gothic drama that allowed them to share the screen again. Meanwhile, Jean's star was rising quickly on the American side. By the mid-1950s, she was starring in big projects. One notable example is Guys and Dolls, 1955, directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz, featuring Marlon Brando and Frank Sinatra. She replaced Grace Kelly in the role of Sister Sarah, showcasing not only her graceful screen presence, but also a flair for comedic and musical performance. The film became a massive success, and it eventually led to her Golden Globe win. Jean Simmons now had formal accolades to go with her popularity. Her marriage to Granger didn't last forever. By 1960, they divorced. She soon fell in love with another older man, Richard Brooks, an accomplished director and writer known for classics like Elmer Gantry. They married later that same year. Some people speculated that she was searching for a father figure because her real father had died when she was so young, but Jean refuted that, stating that her husbands were nothing like her gentle, soft-spoken dad. Whatever the psychological dynamics, the partnership with Brooks brought new opportunities. One such film was The Happy Ending, 1969, directed by Brooks, in which Jean played an alcoholic wife. That role earned her a second Academy Award nomination, though ironically, the film was Brooks's attempt to confront Jean's own growing struggles with alcohol, a confrontation that foreshadowed the eventual collapse of their marriage in 1977. By 1980, they were divorced, and Jean found herself drifting into a phase of life where good roles became harder to find, and her dependency on alcohol increased. Her recollections from the 1980s paint a portrait of a star who felt overshadowed by younger, more radiant actresses stepping onto the scene. She mentioned her sense of depression, the difficulty in landing quality scripts, and how the phone stopped ringing as often. Despite the gloom of that period, Jean Simmons managed to stage a kind of personal comeback. She sought help for her drinking problem, acknowledging how it threatened to derail everything she had worked so long to build. Slowly she reemerged, accepting parts that resonated with her talents. One highlight was her starring alongside Anthony Hopkins in The Dawning, 1988, a drama set in 1920s Ireland that let her show her mature elegance. Another noteworthy project saw her reappear in a remake of Great Expectations, this time playing a different part, full circle from her teenage triumph. She also dipped into television. In the late 1980s, she appeared in an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, delighting fans of the sci-fi franchise with her regal bearing. TV miniseries became a popular format for older actresses, and Jean adapted seamlessly, offering nuanced performances to viewers who remembered her from The Robe, 1953, Desiree, 1954, and Spartacus, 1960, although it's worth noting that some confuse her with actress Jean Seberg or Kiss's Jean Simmons, which she found mildly amusing. She even lent her remarkable voice to Howl's Moving Castle, 2004, the English version of the classic Hayao Miyazaki anime, proving that her artistry could span generations and genres. By the time she reached her 70s, Jean Simmons had already accomplished more than she ever dreamed as a child dancing in Somerset. Still, her personal life remained fairly quiet. After her divorce from Brooks, she chose not to remarry, living with a dog and 2 cats in Santa Monica. She seemed at peace with this solitude, occasionally interviewed about the golden age of Hollywood or the shifts she'd seen in the film industry over the decades. She was never the sort of celebrity to hog tabloids or chase headlines. Perhaps that was part of her enduring appeal, a dignity that matched the refined character she portrayed. Her final years brought the challenge of lung cancer, a diagnosis that inevitably led to reflection. Yet she faced it with the same understated stoicism that had defined her approach to heartbreak and professional setbacks. On January 22, 2010, just 9 days shy of her 81st birthday, Jean Simmons passed away. Movie buffs and classic film enthusiasts mourned the loss of a performer who had enriched so many mid-century classics, from Shakespearean drama to breezy musicals. The obituaries highlighted her humility, the versatility of her screen presence, and the intangible glow that made her a sought-after leading lady for more than 3 decades. Those who knew her best spoke of her as an enduring friend and collaborator, someone who rarely let bitterness over lost roles or sour industry politics sour her disposition. In retrospect, it's surprising she managed so much. The girl who believed she might simply follow her mother's path, living a normal life, ended up tangling with Hollywood titans, collecting major awards, and working alongside icons like Marlon Brando, Frank Sinatra, and Kirk Douglas. She survived the cutthroat manipulations of Howard Hughes, endured the heartbreak of 2 divorces, wrestled her own demons with alcohol, and still returned to delight audiences in old age. That breadth of experience adds layers to her filmography. The star we see in each role, be it the luminous Estella, the sweet-voiced Sister Sarah, or the poignant older matriarch in her final appearances, carries a quiet resilience behind the glitz and glamour. To appreciate Jean Simmons fully, one might watch her transitions over the years. Start with Great Expectations or Caesar and Cleopatra, glimpsing the lively innocence in her eyes. Then shift to 1950s Hollywood, catching her in musicals or sprawling costume epics, realizing how gracefully she could match A-listers in star power without overshadowing them. Move on to the 1960s, noticing the complexity she brought to heavier roles, culminating in an Academy Award nomination for a portrayal that mirrored her personal struggles. Finally, see her 1980s and 1990s work in TV and small but choice film roles, where the motherly warmth or dignified patrician figure she played reveals an older actress at peace with her craft, if not always at peace with the industry's limited offerings. Throughout it all, she never lost that aura of being somewhat shy, introspective, a paradoxical trait for a star. Directors frequently commented on how, off-camera, she maintained a gentle, almost fragile demeanor, yet once the cameras rolled, she could project a commanding stillness that drew every eye to her. That ability to switch from modest to mesmerizing was probably key to her longevity in show business. So many mid-century actresses fizzled out when the aesthetic tastes shifted, but Jean navigated those changes with a certain gentle tenacity, always finding enough roles to remind everyone that her brilliance hadn't waned. She never became the sort of celebrity who courted scandal. Paparazzi seldom hounded her, except during that early flap with Howard Hughes. She believed in letting the work speak for itself. In interviews, she often expressed gratitude more than ambition, marveling that a stroke of luck had plucked her from wartime London's gloom and placed her on international stages. Her own modesty might have undersold the discipline and adaptability that sustained her career for half a century. Looking back, it's striking how many well-known performers from that era recall Gene Simmons with fondness. Some mention that her presence on set elevated everyone else's game. Others note that she maintained an almost old-world courtesy. Those qualities, combined with a willingness to bear emotional vulnerability on screen, made her a go-to actress for everything from gritty dramas to musicals, and from epic historical adventures to introspective television projects. She had the voice, the dancer's grace, and the intangible sincerity that made audiences believe in her characters. And so, as film historians piece together the puzzle of 20th century cinema, they often find a glowing mosaic of Gene Simmons's roles. She is an essential part of the post-World War II British film renaissance, seamlessly bridging that success into Hollywood stardom, then weathering the transition from black and white melodramas to lavish Technicolor musicals and CinemaScope spectacles, and eventually gliding into the smaller screens of the 1980s. Each chapter testifies to her adaptability. Whether starring opposite Laurence Olivier in Hamlet, sharing musical numbers with Marlon Brando in Guys and Dolls, or later exchanging lines with Anthony Hopkins in The Dawning, Gene Simmons consistently proved she belonged. One could argue that she never quite reached the same marquee name status in modern pop culture as contemporaries like Audrey Hepburn or Elizabeth Taylor, even though she was equally gifted. The overshadowing of her name by that of Gene Simmons from Kiss in later decades might have contributed to some younger audiences mixing them up, but within classic film circles, her place is assured. Even if she didn't chase publicity or orchestrate a flamboyant public persona, her performances remain undeniably potent. The fact that she brought an authentic fragility and conviction to roles that might have otherwise felt cliché continues to enchant today's viewers. That's the mark of real acting prowess. When asked in an interview what she thought about all the ups and downs of her life, from the heyday of her youth to the quieter latter years, she once said something to the effect that it was surprising she had done so much. Perhaps she'd never quite shed that sense of wonder, the memory of a shy teenager thinking acting was just 5 pounds a day and an excuse to dress up. For audiences, that sense of humility only made her success more endearing. She died on January 22, 2010 of lung cancer in Santa Monica, 9 days shy of what would have been her 81st birthday. Her departure came quietly, overshadowed by the modern swirl of media distractions. Yet tributes emerged across the globe. Filmmakers, old co-stars, and fans of classic cinema remembered her as more than just an actress. She was a transformative figure who embodied the transitional era between old Hollywood glamour and contemporary performance. She had starred in biblical epics, romantic comedies, psychological dramas, and big musicals, leaving behind an impressive breadth. In the end, perhaps the final measure of her legacy is how often people still rediscover her. A modern viewer stumbling upon Great Expectations or Guys and Dolls might ask, who is this actress and why haven't I heard more about her? Then they open a door to a filmography that seldom disappoints. They see the earnest sparkle in her eyes, even in black and white cinematography from the 1940s, and the luminous presence she brought to color films in the 1950s and 1960s. They learn about her comedic timing, her dramatic intensity, and the personal challenges she overcame, from an oppressive studio boss to personal battles with alcoholism. In that way, she remains a thoroughly relatable icon, testament to how even stardom can't insulate a person from real human struggles. So, if you have a favorite Gene Simmons film, it might be the Dickensian adaptation that gave her a foothold in the industry. or the Shakespearean tragedy that earned her an Oscar nod, or the breezy musical where she sang alongside Brando. Perhaps it's a later performance from the 1980s, showing she could hold her own in modern roles just as well. Or maybe it's her voice work in an anime classic, bridging cultural boundaries. Whichever it is, it's worth taking a moment to acknowledge that behind those roles stood a woman who combined quiet determination with a gentle soul, and who carried the show business scars of volatile Hollywood feuds, yet somehow managed to keep shining. Gene Simmons's presence in Hollywood coincided with a transformative chapter in the film industry, one often perceived as the unstoppable golden age, brimming with possibilities and overshadowed by powerful studio executives. In an era when stars were bound to multi-year, sometimes rigid contracts, actresses faced a gauntlet of creative limitations, behind-the-scenes politics, and personal pressures. Yet Jean navigated that world with a resilience that underscored both her talent and her capacity to endure the system's trials. Unlike many hopefuls who arrived in Hollywood chasing instant glory, Jean already had significant momentum thanks to her British successes. From David Lean's Great Expectations to Laurence Olivier's Hamlet, she was thus both an insider and an outsider, a British import recognized for delivering nuanced performances, yet still expected to abide by the unspoken rules of Tinseltown. In the early 1950s, numerous studios were scrambling to lock down promising actresses under contracts that afforded studio heads near total control over role assignments, public image, and even personal relationships. For Jean, who'd grown accustomed to a certain degree of freedom in British cinema, the shift was stark. The tension erupted most vividly in her feud with Howard Hughes at RKO. Stories of him meddling in film sets, sometimes insisting directors add scenes purely for his own whims or ignoring the well-being of performers, were legendary. Hughes's conflict with Jean revealed how precarious a performer's status could be. If a studio boss had a personal vendetta, it could shape an actress's entire career trajectory, leading to missed roles and wasted potential. Her case was particularly telling. At one point, she was the prime candidate for the lead in William Wyler's Roman Holiday, a film destined to become a classic. Yet Hughes refused to lend her out, effectively costing her the part that would instead catapult Audrey Hepburn to international fame. That single instance exemplified the power dynamics at play. While some actresses might have capitulated, perhaps placating Hughes or altering their professional and personal decisions to avoid confrontation, Jean stood her ground. She filed lawsuits, forced negotiations, and ultimately freed herself from that oppressive contract, even if it meant starring in a no-pay final film for RKO as a condition of her release. It was a bold move, particularly for someone in her early 20s, underscoring that Jean believed in her own worth enough to defy a titan of the industry. Yet that defiance took a toll. When she later looked back on the RKO era, she indicated that part of her struggled with the emotional strain of constant conflict. Howard Hughes's animosity was infamous. He was known to direct directors to treat her harshly on set. But according to some retellings, the rest of the crew frequently sympathized with her plight. Actors and technicians alike saw that her quiet dignity did not disguise the anxiety she felt under constant scrutiny. Indeed, one story that circulated described how Otto Preminger, pressured by Hughes, orchestrated repeated on-camera slaps by her co-star, an ordeal so distressing that the co-star himself lost his temper and turned on Preminger. That outburst showed that Jean's colleagues recognized an injustice in how she was being treated, but the industry structure allowed men like Hughes to operate with minimal accountability. Such battles were far from isolated. Actresses like Olivia de Havilland, Bette Davis, and others had waged their own legal challenges against studios that restricted their personal and creative freedoms. Jean joined that lineage, one of the quieter but no less determined women who advanced the cause of performer rights by pushing back on rigid contractual obligations. In doing so, she illustrated the subtle forms of power an actress could wield. She wasn't a rabble-rouser in the public sense. She didn't embark on media campaigns to air her grievances. Instead, she relied on the courts and let her skill and professionalism speak for her in subsequent roles. The result was that she emerged from the RKO fiasco with her reputation intact and more resolute in curating her career on her own terms. Her continuing success demonstrated that no single executive, no matter how influential, could fully derail someone as gifted as Jean Simmons. She quickly rebounded from the disastrous final RKO film, focusing on productions that let her display her trademark combination of soulful gaze, refined diction, and understated emotional depth. Over the following years, she worked with directors and co-stars who valued her subtlety, fueling a series of roles that kept her name in the spotlight. For instance, stepping into musicals like Guys and Dolls, 1955, allowed her to reveal a surprising comedic and musical flair, while biblical or historical epics such as The Robe, 1953, and Spartacus, 1960, showcased a stately persona reminiscent of her teenage turns in Shakespeare. Her personal story carried its own complexity. She had navigated 2 marriages, first to Stuart Granger, then to Richard Brooks. Both alliances shaped her in different ways. Granger's outspoken defense of her during the Hughes quarrel exemplified the intense loyalty and drama that characterized old Hollywood marriages. Their eventual divorce signaled that personal synergy was not guaranteed, even for 2 charismatic talents with shared British roots. Then came Richard Brooks, a renowned director and writer whose demands often bordered on the obsessive. From the outside, they appeared the epitome of a Hollywood power couple, her graceful screen presence alongside his creative fervor. Yet behind closed doors, an undercurrent of tension grew. Brooks' revelation that he wrote The Happy Ending, 1969, specifically to highlight Jean's drinking problem, was a deeply personal, almost invasive approach to merging life and art. On screen, her portrayal of an alcoholic wife earned her a second Oscar nomination, but off-screen, the film's subtext cut too close. The friction eventually led to a split, culminating in divorce by 1980. And so by the dawn of the 1980s, Jean stood at a crossroads. Hollywood had changed dramatically from the robust studio system of her youth. Up-and-coming actresses, younger and armed with fresh marketing angles, began overshadowing older stars in an industry that seldom offered meaty roles to women over 40. She also faced her own inner battles, turning to alcohol more heavily when scripts and phone calls became scarce. Fans might have assumed her calm, cultured demeanor protected her from such vices, but addiction often lurks unpredictably. She later spoke candidly about the sense of despair that overcame her, an actress raised to stardom as a teenager, now struggling to find relevant, challenging parts in a business obsessed with novelty. Still, she found avenues to persevere. In Europe, where classic film stardom was revered longer, producers reached out occasionally, offering cameo roles or ensemble pieces that paid homage to her legacy. In the United States, television miniseries and guest appearances provided a more flexible platform. The Star Trek, The Next Generation guest spot, exemplified her adaptability. Stepping into a futuristic setting decades removed from Great Expectations or Caesar and Cleopatra, She seamlessly commanded her scenes, captivating an entirely new generation of viewers. Many younger fans only discovered her older works after realizing the stately guest star in their favorite sci-fi show had once played Ophelia for Sir Laurence Olivier. She also dipped into voice work, culminating in that memorable turn for the English language version of Hayao Miyazaki's Howl's Moving Castle, 2004. Lending her voice to the older Sophie allowed Jean to convey layers of compassion, wit, and vulnerability purely through vocal inflection, skills honed over a lifetime of performing. This foray into anime introduced her to fans who had likely never watched a black and white British drama or a 1950s Hollywood musical. The synergy between her storied career and Miyazaki's imaginative storytelling was surprisingly organic, a testament to her continued relevance and broad appeal. Such achievements underline how thoroughly she outlasted the era's studio constraints. Decades removed from the contract battles with Howard Hughes, she had grown into a figure of quiet authority, capable of dipping into roles large or small, comedic or dramatic, live action or animated. Her survival in an industry known for discarding former ingenues was a victory in itself. Yet she never came across as someone who relished victory laps. Even in interviews reflecting on her extended filmography, Jean spoke with a tinge of wonder, almost as though she too was stunned by how far that shy teenager singing a novelty tune had come. Her final years in Santa Monica, surrounded by pets, might seem incongruent for a one-time star. But to those who followed her career, it signaled a certain peacefulness. She had contended with production moguls, endured heartbreak, wrestled with personal demons, and still carved out a revered place in cinematic history. Occasionally, she'd appear at film retrospectives or engage in nostalgic conversations about the Golden Age. Journalists who interviewed her observed a warm graciousness peppered with occasional self-deprecating humor, remnants of the wide-eyed dancer who never fully believed she could become an international star. When news of her passing emerged in January 2010, responses spanned the globe. British newspapers commemorated one of their own, the beloved star of Great Expectations, who had gone on to conquer Hollywood. American tributes recalled her luminous presence in works spanning from The Robe to the Thornbirds, a 1983 miniseries cameo often overlooked. Her old co-stars, some of whom were still active, lamented that a real cornerstone of the mid-century film scene had departed. Younger fans, stumbling upon her name, found a filmography that defied easy categorization: period dramas, musicals, epics, romances, comedies, even science fiction voice acting. Each phase bore the mark of her understated elegance. Film scholars note how her versatility echoes that of other major actresses, but with fewer headlines or controversies. She didn't inhabit the flamboyance of an Elizabeth Taylor or a Marilyn Monroe, nor the outspoken activism of a Jane Fonda. Instead, she quietly adapted, letting the roles speak for her. This approach, while perhaps not lending itself to tabloid prominence, garnered her significant respect within the profession. Directors praised her as an actor's actor, someone who could convey depth with minimal fuss, absorbing direction with an almost intuitive understanding. Co-stars from Marlon Brando to Richard Burton found her to be a giving scene partner, uninterested in stealing the spotlight so much as elevating the collaborative process. Such an ethic mirrored changes in the industry itself. The meltdown of the old studio system, spurred on by legal challenges and antitrust actions, ushered in an era where performers had slightly more autonomy. Jean's earlier battles with Howard Hughes, therefore, could be seen as part of a broader wave in which artists, particularly women, fought for creative control. She never boasted about it as some grand crusade, but her success in stepping away from oppressive contracts foreshadowed the 1950s to 1960s shift toward greater performer agency. Her achievements became a subtle but pertinent piece of Hollywood's evolving labor dynamics. Moreover, the attention around her cameo in Star Trek: The Next Generation underscores how her appeal transcended generational boundaries. Decades after Great Expectations, fans of a sci-fi series discovered a performer who commanded the screen with the same magnetic quality. The storyline might have been futuristic, but her classical poise held viewers' attention, bridging old and new. The cameo exemplified a career that spanned black and white British post-war cinema, big-budget 1950s epics, 1960s musicals and dramas, 1970s and 1980s television, and even early 2000s animation. If that breadth doesn't define a survivor, what does? And through it all, one can't forget the emotional struggles, especially her descent into alcohol dependency. Many industry veterans shared that fate, especially in a Hollywood that favored youth and cast aside older actresses. Yet Jean's choice to confront her addiction, spurred in part by the unraveling of her second marriage, was an act of self-preservation that let her re-emerge with dignity, culminating in that steady string of roles in her later years. Indeed, when she spoke about the happy ending, she seemed torn between pride in the performance that earned her an Oscar nod and sorrow that the film's narrative echoed her personal reality of drinking and marital strife. That duality, the interplay between on-screen and off-screen experiences, shaped the emotional resonance audiences picked up in her acting. Modern fans, discovering her older work in restoration or streaming formats, often remark on the sincerity behind her eyes, a trait that might be overshadowed in an era of bigger, flashier performances. Some of her best roles were those that demanded nuance, a wordless expression, a slight tremble in the voice, or a silent acceptance of fate. She excelled in these interior moments, revealing vulnerability without melodrama. It was a skill gleaned, perhaps, from her early British training, or maybe from the real-life adversity that forced her to grow up quickly. Either way, it made her an in-demand actress whenever a director needed an emotional anchor for a scene. As more and more of her films become accessible digitally, ranging from lesser-known gems to her famous hits, audiences continue to reassess her impact. The prevailing sentiment is that Jean Simmons represents a quiet force, a consistent presence who transcended the limitations of her time and place. Younger scholars find her story integral to understanding the post-war film industry's shifting gender politics, the tension between British and Hollywood production styles, and the complexities faced by women who rose to fame while still in their teens. All this nuance ties back to the original point. She exemplified an era when Hollywood's machinery was vast and sometimes merciless, yet her experience stands as proof that personal resolve could mitigate that power imbalance. Her battles with Howard Hughes speak to the resilience of a performer who refused to be bullied, while her ultimate trajectory, staying relevant across multiple decades, proves that a combination of innate talent, adaptability, and a certain graciousness could trump the forces arrayed against her. She left behind numerous indelible on-screen moments in the truest sense, each one a testament to perseverance and skill. Ultimately, the final chapters of her life spent in relative seclusion were characterized less by bitterness and more by reflection. She recognized she had lived a life of improbable achievements, a post-war British teenager who soared to the apex of Hollywood stardom, overcame studio feuds and personal crises, and continued acting almost until her final breath. Reflecting on that journey underscores not just the glitz of stardom, but also the deep personal costs, the quiet heartbreaks, and the resilience required to remain authentic in an industry known for commodifying beauty and discarding yesterday's stars. That is the essence of Jean Simmons, an actress who bridged two worlds, post-war British cinema and the glimmering, sometimes cutthroat Hollywood studio system, absorbed everything they threw at her, and emerged as a figure admired by fans, respected by colleagues, and championed by historians of film. Her legacy, built on that synergy of grit and grace, persists. It persists in the quiet admiration of movie buffs who revisit Great Expectations or Spartacus, in the younger voices discovering her through modern streaming platforms, and in the memory of an industry that once tried to tame her spirit, yet never managed to break it. Looking back at her story also underscores an important theme. Success can ebb and flow, and self-doubt may creep in, especially when younger stars step into the spotlight. For Jean, the 1980s were painful, overshadowed by her sense that prime roles had become scarce. Still, she found new mediums, television, voice acting, and reclaimed a sense of purpose. Many older stars fade quietly, but Jean managed to remind the world of her enduring skill set, culminating in appearances that validated her as more than a relic of a golden age. In the grand tapestry of film history, Jean Simmons occupies a distinctive position, bridging British post-war cinema, the golden age of Hollywood musicals and epics, and the transformation into modern TV and anime dubbing. Not every star from the mid-20th century can claim such breadth. She did it with style, occasionally battling personal demons, but always returning to the screen with that signature combination of vulnerability and dignity. It's a legacy that calls out to be revisited by anyone who loves classic storytelling, a testament to a quiet, powerful presence that shaped decades of entertainment. And, in the end, that might just be the best tribute one can give, to keep watching her films, keep telling her story, and keep marveling at the nuance and warmth she brought to each role, from her teenage days as Estella in Great Expectations to her valedictory performances that capped an extraordinary career.